Welcome back to Hot Takes and Deep Dives. This is Jess, and I am extremely excited. You know, in over 20 seasons of more than 20 seasons of The Real World, there really are two that are truly the most memorable. Aside from New York, the debut season, Real World's truthfully most culturally significant season is certainly San Francisco. And I'm here with Mohammed Bilal, the musician, poet, and voice of reason in the show's most ethnically diverse, groundbreaking third season. Hey, Mohammed.
Hey, what's going on?
How are you today?
Good to be with you.
How you feeling?
To be honest, I've been doing a lot, so I'm a little burnt out, but I feel good right now. So,
What have you been up to? Tell me.
well, a lot since The Real World, but for the last 20 years, really, I've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion work, kind of blending it with my artwork, with poetry, with spoken word and hip hop. And over the years, it's landed me at Stanford University, and I oversee an office that does that work. My office is called the Office for Inclusion, Belonging, and Intergroup Communication.
You're still in San Francisco?
Still in San Francisco, spending a lot of time on campus, but yes, still in San Francisco.
And you were originally from San Francisco, right?
My family moved to San Francisco when I was 11 years old. So on that show, I was a San Franciscan for sure.
Amazing.
Yes, that was home.
I mean, to take everybody back, San Francisco aired in 1994, and this is Gen X. You know, at that time, that was the year Friends premiered. Reality Bites was like the biggest movie ever at that time. It was all about basically people who were slackers and didn't work. Like, that was sort of the reputation of the Gen X generation. What separated you guys is that you guys really were the opposite. You were actively working to make something of yourselves. You were artists and really trying to make an impact in the world.
For sure. I actually think the folks who did the casting, and I don't remember their names, unfortunately, but they were two amazing women in San Francisco. They had a lot of sensitivity for diversity and for other issues. And I just remember, meeting with them. So my band at the time had a record deal with Sony Music, and our A&R, who is the sort of person who will scout different artists that they think are ready to be signed, is named Dave Margulies. And Dave Margulies said, hey, this amazing show. I didn't have a TV. Neither did my best friend.
Oh, so you hadn't seen the first two seasons?
I had no idea. I was an artist. I was living on a limited income. I was just hustling and making it work. And all I wanted to do was have my, band do well. My whole world was music, to be honest. And our A&R approached us and said, hey, I think this would be a great awareness campaign for what you all are doing. And I had this live instrumentation hip hop band. And so I applied. My accomplice on the music side, my best friend Willpower, he was like, I don't want to do it. We lived together. We were led to the band. And he's like, it's enough me living with you, let alone living with a bunch of other folks. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote an application and sent it in, made a video of myself and sent it to them. And they called me and they started having me come to these interviews. And I did that for about 4 months. So I think part of the reason that the show was, or the folks on the show ended up having such rich lives, was that the casting directors were given time, and the Northridge earthquake hit at the end of that winter, the winter of '93. And because of that, the show got pushed back even further, which meant they had more time to keep interviewing us, and they would send cameras to, my girlfriend and I would hang out, and they'd send cameras there and film us, and so by the time they got ready to cast everyone, I think that time and that patience, which is the same thing, by the way, now with research around diversity.
Yes.
It shows that when you're hiring and you want diverse staff, you have to spend more time. You have to be really thoughtful. You have to come up with a process. You can't rush. When you rush and when you're too busy to pay attention to the process, you don't get good, diverse candidates. And so I think that, a lot of credit for that show, particularly with bringing in folks like Pedro, bringing Judd Winick in, Pam Ling, like, I think all of that was really connected to like the job those two women did. I don't think they get enough credit. That's why I'm bringing them up, because then it became all the producers who are mostly men, right? But it was those two women who did the initial casting and got us the folks that we are now looking at from all over the country.
Mm-hmm. And you were what? You were like 24 years old around when you filmed this?
I was 23 when I got cast on The Real World. Yeah.
I know that Judd and Pam, obviously they've been married this whole time. They also still live in San Francisco. Do you ever see them?
I do see Judd and Pam. I haven't seen them in a while because of the pandemic. But my son and daughter are both big fans of Judd's Hilo series. And yeah, we've been able to connect here and there. Not as much as we'd like to. We talk about it a lot. But yes, we cross paths a lot, and Judd and I communicate a lot, really care a lot for Judd and Pam. I think they're amazing, and their children are amazing. So,
a lot of people have been doing big rewatch binges of The Real World because, with the reunion that's currently airing of the New York series. So I went back and I revisited San Francisco, and it struck me how comfortable you all were discussing race. Rather than getting into arguments, they were more conversations.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, I think there was a lot going on in the house. Interestingly enough, I wrote a book about it and essentially almost got sued by MTV for wanting to put this book out. So that's a whole nother story. But
I want to hear that story.
Yeah. So I'll have to send it to you at some point. I'll just email it to you and you can take a look at the book too.
So wait. Talk about this book. You wrote a book about what specifically?
So I keep a journal. I've always done that, and I'm a writer. So when I went on the show, there were a couple of things. One was I was in this band. I had a deal with Sony Music already, and I was relatively savvy because I started doing music when I was 11 years old, right? Like I was relatively savvy about the entertainment industry. And so I had an attorney, entertainment lawyer, and they looked at the contract from MTV and they said, look, this is not, like, we can't do this. Like, this contradicts the things we're doing with Sony and everything else. And so my attorney continued to rework the contract they had given me so that they didn't own the copyright. Like, these contracts are so ironclad that MTV would put out. They would say, look, we own the copyright and authorship of who you are.
They owned your story rights, right? Your personal story rights.
They own you, essentially, yes. Your story rights, you, and they had gotten sued about 3 years, or I believe 3 or 4 years, from one of the old VJs, right? From like the early days of MTV, who had sued them because of age discrimination. She didn't win. What she then did is her and her lawyer figured out this other approach, which was she had signed an early contract with MTV. I'm telling you all this inside stuff right now. And that contract did not have some of the newer language, right? So the old language said that we own the rights to who you are in this world, right? So globally. And what she argued for was that MTV's signal was being broadcast off of satellites, which meant that it was in the universe. And so her attorneys went back. I'm serious. Law is so fascinating.
Wait, who is this VJ, by the way? Who are you referring to?
This is, I can't remember her name, but she's awesome. And I love her even more after. Well, as we talk, I'm going to look it up online.
Yeah, look it up. I got to know
it might have been Martha Quinn.
Martha Quinn. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was Martha Quinn. And so what she did was, they said, hey, you're broadcasting my image into outer space, which is a breach of the contract. And they had to pay her and settle this suit. So by the time the contract got to me and the other folks, and I'm sure it's even crazier now, but for that season of The Real World, it essentially said, I'd never seen anything like it, but essentially said, we own the copyright and authorship of who you are, like you as a person, right? Your name, everything. And what my attorney and I interpreted that to mean was that they would own anything I created while I was in the house. And that was our big gripe, was I don't want to make music because I was one of the main producers in my band. I don't want to create songs. And then MTV literally has the rights to those songs, right? And so we changed all that language, and they let it go through because there was this rush to get the show produced after the Northridge earthquake, and they were delayed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think was one of the reasons they went along with it so easily. But no one else in the house had changed their contract at all. And so for all of those people, they own their their likeness. And so when I wrote this book, they said, look, you can put the book out, but you can't use anyone's name. You can't use what would feel like a facsimile of them, right? Because we own it. For the 6 months that they lived in the house, we own who they are. And so you can't put this book out. And so that became sort of the conundrum that I got into.
This is random, but did you by any chance keep watching The Real World like in the following years?
I watched it for a few years. I mean, I haven't kept up recently, except for I do know that they're doing the New York season because I'm still connected with folks at Bon and Mary, which is the production company that produces the show. And Kevin Powell is a good friend of mine. And so, Kevin
I was going to ask if you know him. Yeah.
So I'm friends with the network of Real World people generally.
So Melissa Beck, who was a breakout cast member on the New Orleans season, she has publicly said that at that time they were only paid $5,000 for the entire season.
Oh, it was the same for us. It was $5,000 for us too.
That just seems astoundingly low.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays it is. And, and I don't know if she was part of this. I don't know if Melissa was part of this, but they did a reunion special where they brought us all together and we all started exchanging notes. And this was down in Los Angeles. And then one of us reached out, I can't remember who, reached out to SAG-AFTRA and said, hey, you all need to create as a union these rights for reality-based TV shows. And we got a bunch of folks to sign onto this petition and, sort of sent it to MTV and said, look, you all should be paying us more. We should be getting royalties. We found out that our shows were being syndicated, which was a whole nother pot of, funds. Mm-hmm. And so we pushed this. It just didn't have enough energy and it didn't get through. MTV eventually, or Bon and Mary, I can't remember which one, sent us another check, but it was like for, an additional $5,000 or something like that. It wasn't any real money. And then most of us just dropped it. But there was a little push at one point to be like, hey, we need to change, what's going on in terms of this revenue model. Yeah, it's bad, but you're a kid. I mean, that's the other side of it. Like when I look back at being 23, I'm like, even though I knew a lot, I had an attorney, I didn't know enough to say we should be getting paid more for this show. You're just so excited to be like, I'm on TV and people are going to be watching me. And I can say it's benefited me in other ways. I've been able to leverage it to do other things. But, I think it's sad that they cheapen, like you can have these young people who are in real life situations. And then you take like Jersey Shore and, folks are getting paid $200,000 an episode.
I mean, housewives are making $1 million a season.
There you go.
I know. I'm sure that makes you want to jump off a building.
Well, I mean, it's I try not to dwell in the past. And it's part of the reason why I don't really get caught up in too much of the fray on social media or anything else around the real world, because it was part of my life and I really appreciate it. It was a great experience. I have a lot of great friends from it and memories and experiences. It's opened a lot of doors for me. I wouldn't change it. And I have a great life now that I definitely wouldn't change, with a wonderful family and people I care about who care about me. So, at the end of the day, like, my life is still good. So I don't have too much to complain about.
It all worked out. In going through your cast, we're saying this really was the most racially and ethnically diverse cast. We had Pam, who was Chinese American, Pedro, who was Cuban, you're Black, a practicing Muslim. What's interesting is that many of the race conversations were led by the perspectives of the white cast members, like Rachel and Puck. What was that about?
I mean, I think some of that's editing, to be honest. But so I knew immediately when I came in the house that day one, because what happened was we all showed up, meaning all of the house members, the sort of cast members showed up except for Puck on the first day. And we were all gathered in the landing, right? The stairwell landing, kind of the mezzanine level of this house. And we're all having a good time. You know, we're all exchanging information about each other. And it's just sort of like lively, wow. And everyone seems pretty nice. And it's like, wow, this is a good group of people. And about 30 minutes into that interaction, Puck shows up, right? And Puck comes up the steps. He's got his bike, you know, and he's full of scabs and the whole nine. You're like, who is this person, right? And he literally just gets there and starts pointing to people and saying, "You suck," and from the point blank, right, from the first day. And so I'm just observing, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, here's this scabby, smelly, like white dude, and he can essentially be a rebel in the house and do all this stuff and still be accepted and still be casted on the show, to be honest, right? But I know I couldn't do that because of the way society sees me, and sort of folks have been socialized racially to see someone of African descent in the house. And so I'm immediately going, okay, I get strategically what's going on. They need one person to stir the pot, which is actually something Puck would say all the time. I'm just here to stir the pot, right? He was casted late, they said on purpose, because they found out that all the people they casted, which was a good group of folks, right? I mean, you think of Pedro, you think of Judd, you think of Pam, right? You even think of Rachel, right? Like Rachel added something meaningful to the show, good or bad, right? Mm-hmm. But Puck shows up and Puck is like, hey, I am a quintessential like rebel. And so inside of that rebellion, quote unquote, are ideas about freedom, right? Who has the freedom to be that type of rebel and who doesn't? If you had a Black person trying to be free in that way, I'm going to show up with my shirt off, with scabs all over my body, and I stink. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to tell you, you suck. They would have kicked them off the show immediately, right? Or if I had shown up that way. And so there was a double standard there. And I think race started to sort of permeate, right, the conversations because of Puck's presence, which I think is really interesting. It wasn't because of my presence, right? It wasn't because of Pedro, who's Cuban, right? It wasn't because of Pam, who's Chinese. It really was about Puck. And I think this is where we get into the conversation about the pervasiveness of white supremacy, right? Like this all tied in, right? If you pull the sheets back on what was actually happening. And so it was being raised because it was being raised by this sort of self-styled rebel.
I mean, he invented the art of the stunt queen on reality TV.
Yeah, pretty much. You know, so I live with Puck. When I say I live with Puck, when we drew straws for who's going to be in what room, I said, I will stay with this person. I had a straw. I could have picked anyone, but I saw the disdain that everyone else had for Puck. And, you know, like I care about all people. I mean, you know, my best friend that I grew up with is this tall African-American man named Will Powell. My other best friend is Josh Goldstein. You know what I mean? So like someone who like on paper we're polar opposites, but in real life we're best friends. So I was always open to like different types of people, and I knew how to navigate people like Puck. And I could tell the other folks in the house were intimidated by him. There was going to be a lot for them. And there were things that I was even able to connect with Puck around, music, some other things that he enjoyed. And so I was like, let me use that as a way to sort of mitigate, right? Like this person's impact on everyone else in the house. So we lived together in the same room. So I got to know Puck pretty well. I would say better than most people in the house. And what I saw was that behind the scenes, or the scenes they cut that they didn't show, because you can edit someone any way you want, to be honest. If I film you all day, I can just take the parts where you're aggressive and put those all together, and you seem like the most aggressive person in the house. So Puck to me was a construction. Like they constructed who he was. And the part they constructed, however bad it came off on TV, he was worse in real life.
Yes.
Like in real life, he was way worse.
Yes, I heard that they edited out some of the most offensive things that he did. Oh, yeah. Like they wanted him to be a guy you loved to hate, and they wanted him to be the funny.
No, exactly. You got it right. That's exactly what he was. He was because you need conflict, and I get it as a storyteller, right? But I mean, behind the scenes, he would tell the women, like, if they bent over, hey, keep bending over. I mean, he was always saying these things where you're like, really, man, come on, that's wrong. He would call Pedro the F word all the time. Like, that wasn't like once or twice where he's talking about his sexual orientation. It was constantly.
He was
right?
incredibly homophobic.
Incredibly homophobic. And he did a lot of racist tropes, right? There were tons of things that Puck would do. Some of it was his sort of like manipulation. I got to see that after a while, that it was him playing with form, right? Like, I'm going to play with it. So watch me play with it. And so I don't know how much of it he actually believed, but he had hung around enough people who held those views to be able to kind of spout different things like, oh, the swastika is like an ancient Indian symbol. And so you could tell he had hung around a little bit in some circles that sort of like veered on white supremacy and white supremacists, right? So he knew some of that stuff, but he was also like, some of it wasn't believable. It's like, well, you're not really one of those guys, right? Like, so he played with it. He had this, like, he was playing with it.
As far as production goes, Judd had said that the director and the producer went to such irritating lengths to make sure that nothing was manufactured. Like, they told you guys so little, they did so little. Like, what was the process like day to day as far as just the production of this television show?
Once a week we would have a house meeting. So we like had to be in the house for, I think, 2 hours or 3 hours once a week, where they captured a lot of great interactions with us. They also once a week would take us off to a site somewhere and shoot these interviews with us and sort of ask us about the week. And then they would follow groups of us when we would go places. So it wasn't structured from the point of view of like, you have to do this or you have to do that, or here's the script. It was very much like we lived our lives, and they would sort of follow our lives. But what they would do is when they interviewed us, they would ask questions. And I only know this because I've done film production. So I sort of started to understand how this works. They would ask us questions in those once a week interviews. And they were very leading questions, right? Mm-hmm. Does Puck like Rachel? You know what I mean? What's going on with Judd and Pam? And they would do these things to kind of like try to elicit answers. And then they had the confessional booth, and really the confessional booth served as a way for them to tie in pieces they were missing, because we'd come and tell them, and they would take that and create a storyline from it. I also noticed that depending on who the groups were and how interesting they thought the groups were, they would assign camera folks to them. Like, they never assigned camera folks to me for most of the stuff I did, right? Like, if I'm out doing stuff with my band, they usually weren't there. Right. I was going to school. They wouldn't follow me to school. Right. I would do things.
Pam was a medical student. She was also working. She was working in a hospital during filming.
Yeah. In Pam's case, I think some of it was confidentiality. I remember talking with her about that. I think they couldn't enter the hospital for certain things. Right. So some of that I don't think was because they didn't want to follow her as much as I think it was because they weren't allowed in there at the time. But you're right. They didn't follow Pam very much. They tried to follow stories they thought where there would be drama. And because, I was low on drama, there was no need to follow me. It's like, we know we're not going to get a lot of drama out of Mohammed, because I wasn't drama in the house either. I was very much like, you all are having drama. I am not going to take this experience and have this experience be a dramatic experience for me, because it didn't need to be. So
later on, like season 10, they could not leave the house. Like, it seemed like you guys had a lot more freedom. Like, if you wanted to, you could legitimately like hide from, easily hide, like go to the library, like you said, work with your band, because they were just going to chase where the story was. That's a significant pivot in the way they started to produce the show eventually.
Yeah, I think it was the worst thing they did to the show, because what they did was they started, so right after our season, and maybe it was because some of our freeform nature, what they did was they created a job, and everyone had to work at this job site. And so what the show became was it became about sort of consumption and then like expressiveness for young people, which is, I'm going to go out to a club. I'm going to go do this thing. Hey, I worked all day. I made money. Now I'm going to go party. Right. And that's what the show devolved into, as opposed to an environment where you had a group of young adults who were talking about life. And I think the richness of our show was that we gathered a lot because we were busy doing our own things, and we came back together in the evening. And the way we decompressed was to talk with each other, was to say, hey, how was your day? Oh, I had this awful thing happen, or, oh, this thing came up. And to me, that's the richness of life, right? And so they missed that. I think they were trying to create a structure where they were able to film more, and that the content was more centralized in the sort of job. But it created a party house, essentially, which was the opposite of what was really happening in San Francisco. Like, we were not a party house. We were a group of, like you said, Gen X folks who were working, who were doing things. I mean, Pedro would get 25, 30 letters a day from fans all over the world. And I would come down the stairs at 6:15 a.m. in the morning, and he's responding to each of the people who wrote him, like, every day. Right? At 23 years old, I'm like, I don't think I would do that. I mean, that's how amazing he was, where he's, literally handwriting letters back to people who've written him, and he's getting bags of letters every day. Like, these were driven people. I mean, Judd was up early in the morning working on his strip every day, right? Pam was a medical student. Like, people had real lives and they were going after it. And I think that's what made that show rich. And after that, they kind of killed it for the other young people. And to be honest, working at a college, at a university, this is what people in that age group want. Like, they want to see how people have these challenging conversations, right? How young people from different backgrounds get together and like communicate. And that's what was rich about that show. And I remember when I got off of it, being asked to come and speak at all these universities. And those are the biggest questions students had. They were all sort of vicariously living through us. They said, oh, when Puck did this to you, when Puck stuck his finger in the peanut butter, how did that make everyone feel? Like, they wanted to get information on how to deal with aberrant behavior.
Let's talk about Pedro. He was very open from the beginning that he was HIV positive, and he would eventually die hours after the final episode of San Francisco aired. Like, they showed he was an AIDS educator. They would show him his scrapbook of his career as an AIDS educator. It seems like he just had the ability to change so many lives. Certainly as a young person watching the show, he was the first person I had ever seen who said they were HIV positive on television. Mm-hmm.
I don't think people realize the significance of Pedro, to be honest, right? For so many reasons. There were so many firsts with Pedro. It wasn't just about him. And he would always say this. He was like, I'm a person living with HIV.
Yes.
Right? That he was a person living his life who happened to have HIV and had refused to not live his life because he had HIV. And so I think if you think of the first, and the producers didn't know this, you know what I mean? This was Pedro. Like, that you have someone who is in this interracial relationship, right? Holding hands, walking down the street, eating at a cafe with Sean, right? Like, you didn't see that on TV. You didn't see that anywhere, And so, I think Pedro represented so many things to so many different people. For us, for the people who got to know him, he was this charismatic, powerful, humble, but at the same time, very determined person. I mean, I talked with him about tons of issues, including race. We talked about race a lot, actually, with him being Cuban American and the sort of racial dynamic in the Cuban community. And one time he told me, he said, Mohammed, I have people in my family who are 10 times darker than you and people who are 10 times lighter, And he said in Cuba, a lot of what happens in terms of how Americans would view race has to deal more with class, really. And so while your skin color matters, it doesn't matter to the same extent. What matters more is who your family is, how much money you have, what's your class level. And so he was the first person to really break those distinctions down for me, right? And I kind of do this work now. But in terms of having HIV, I think he had a limited number of white blood cells or T cells in his body at the time he entered the house, right? He knew he was putting himself in danger, but he felt that the awareness, which is what he was, an educator around these issues, that this show would give him a platform to create awareness for other young people who were struggling with HIV and AIDS and with their sexual orientation, kind of with both, right? So like for queer youth, right, he was someone who's like, I am going to take this hit so that other folks can be inspired by my story and by what I do, what I'm doing. I'm putting my life on the line. And so when someone like Puck is sticking his finger in his peanut butter and he's got this dirty, grubby finger, that bacteria, could have put Pedro in the hospital, and like, that's the level of like, this was a real life. You could kill this person with what you just did. And that was happening in the house a lot. And there was a moment when we were in Pedro and Judd's room. And I remember I wrote a poem about it because there was a look on Pedro's face where he was like, I can't be here anymore. And he had just made up his mind that it's not worth it, to be in this house with this person. And it was specifically about Puck. And everyone else was there. All of us were there. Corey, Rachel, Pam, Judd, and me. The rest of us were in the house. And the energy that exuded off of him was like light. He was pretty much like, I'm going to take a stand. I have to be here for myself. And then he left that night and went to Sean's house. And I remember thinking, wow, this is someone who knows their eventuality, which we all have, and is feeling it and has decided that this TV show, it doesn't matter in that regard. He did come back, but I think it was probably after a lot of deliberation.
How did you feel when Bill Clinton would eventually say that Pedro on The Real World did more for AIDS awareness than the government has up until
I think he was right. I mean, come on, like, think about Pedro. Like, he was this good looking, right? I mean, the part of it was, regardless of your gender, like, people were attracted to Pedro, right? He was this like attractive, sort of charismatic, funny, affable, right? I mean, you could add so many great adjectives to who Pedro was. And people were drawn to him. They were drawn to what he was doing. And you had at the time the largest youth platform, which is no longer, thank goodness. But at the time, the largest youth platform in this country anyway, and probably globally to some extent, in MTV. And so you put this charismatic, amazing, attractive, right, person on a TV show who's talking about it, and it gave people a face. And so people's empathy went up for folks living with HIV and AIDS. People don't realize now is how homophobic folks were, right? Like how vitriolic this sort of energy was towards someone who was homosexual at that time. Our country has changed in that regard, right? Not that it's still that LGBTQ folks don't get beat up on the street and those things don't happen, but the energy was much more intense. It was HIV and AIDS was a gay disease, right? It wasn't anyone can get this.
Well, yeah, they called it the gay cancer.
Exactly. So when Pedro was on the show, it represented so many things were all coalescing at the same time. And he was able to represent that in a way where people could walk away and say, well, hold up, everything I've been taught to believe about these stereotypes, first of all, about gay people isn't true, because I just saw Pedro, right? All these things about folks with HIV and AIDS, right? That they're walking around and they have sores all over their bodies, and that's not true. He's living in this house with all these other people and they're not getting HIV and AIDS. I mean, people thought you just touch the surface and you're going to get it. Right? And so like all of this sort of like fear was around this disease. And Pedro was able to dispel a lot of those things just by being Pedro, right? And that's kind of what I think was so amazing. So I think Bill Clinton's right. For young people who are ones who are sexually active, right? So it woke a lot of young people up to say like, oh, this is a real thing and this affects all of us and we needed to think about it, and think what we're going to do with our bodies.
I know his decline was very rapid. Like he moved back home to Miami when he became sick. What was your friendship or communication with him like once he became very sick and moved back home to Miami?
So Judd and Pam, when Pedro got sick in Miami, they went out there and they were communicating with us and letting us know how he was doing. And then when he got worse, they contacted all of us and we all flew out to Miami. Mm-hmm. And so we spent some time there with Pedro, and then he passed. He passed pretty quickly. Yeah. I mean, it was rough. I mean, it's rough thinking about it now, and there were little times when he got sick in the house too, that it was pretty rough. When he, something would happen and like he would get thrush or he would get something and he was just really down and under the weather. It's hard to see. At that time, I don't think there were any antiviral drugs. I don't think they had the cocktail or anything yet.
Right.
And so this is sort of pretty, kind of this longevity medicine didn't exist at the time. So usually when you got something, you got sick, it could be the end. And that last case was that for Pedro. And then we went to the funeral, and there was, it was a lot.
Tell me about your friendship with Kevin Powell.
So I can't remember where Kevin and I met, but we knew of each other.
Did you meet through the Real World publicity circuit, or did you actually know each other from another world?
Well, interestingly enough, I had never met Kevin. I didn't know about Kevin until I was on the Real World, because I didn't start following the Real World. Like I said, I had no TV until after I was on it.
Yeah. Because he was an activist decades ago.
He was. And I knew Kevin Powell most readily from The Source magazine, which was the biggest hip hop magazine at the time. And he was a big writer for Source. And I was in the hip hop scene, like my band had a deal. And so I knew of him more as a writer than anything else. And then I got to meet Kevin on several occasions. My sister was doing work with the editor of Essence magazine. Kevin was doing work with her. They started connecting. I met Kevin that way. Like, I met him in lots of different circles. And then I moved to New York City, and he was in Brooklyn, and we would cross paths in Brooklyn a lot. So I think it was less, hey, fellow Real Worlder, and much more like someone who's in my circle of people I know. It ended up being much more like that.
Totally.
And it still is.
I have to ask, as far as like this Real World resurgence, the reunion, have you been contacted at all by Buna Murray? Because I know that Jonathan Murray he said to Rolling Stone that they absolutely want to do additional reunions. Like, have you heard anything?
I have not heard anything about a San Francisco reunion. But, I wouldn't be surprised, and I think I'd have to think long and hard about whether I want to do it or I wouldn't. But Jonathan Murray, who I really appreciate, Mary and I had some issues, but Jonathan I really appreciate. So it used to be Mary Ellis.
Yes.
She passed.
What were your issues with Mary Ellis?
And I was young, but I very much felt like we were being exploited in lots of ways. The money piece that you brought up and other things. I mean, I don't really care too much about it now, but at the time I was an activist myself. So I could get agitated by certain things I saw as being unfair or unjust. And I thought that was an injustice. And I let her know it. And she wasn't too fond of me letting her know that. Right. So, and then there are a couple of other funky things, but they were minor, to be honest. But Jonathan and I have formed a pretty decent respect for each other. Like, I see him, not necessarily paying us more money, but definitely putting his money and his power behind HIV and AIDS research and activism. And they started the Pedro Zamora Foundation. They put some of the sort of foundational money down for that, and they still contribute to it. So I've gone to his home and helped fundraise for that program for HIV and AIDS fellows and things like that. And so, I appreciate John. I feel like he's actually committed to some social impact, right? As opposed to just being like, I'm a Hollywood producer and
totally.
I've made money off all these reality shows. He's really committed, particularly to LGBTQ causes and HIV and AIDS research. So I have to commend that. So I actually like him a lot.
I am convinced that everyone's hair drives them nuts. Mine is curly and gets too dry in the winter, too oily in the summer, and I'm constantly having to buy new shampoo and conditioner to just battle the elements. The issue is that there's no one-size-fits-all shampoo or conditioner because we're all coming to the table with a unique body and hair chemistry. Well, I recently found a customized shampoo and conditioner solution called Prose, and it's kind of been saving my life. All you do is go on their website, prose.com, you fill out a quiz about your hair. For example, your hair type, how it feels, where it falls on the oily to dry spectrum, plus questions about your eating and exercise habits. And with Prose's algorithm, Prose finds a unique blend of ingredients to treat your exact concerns. I've been using the custom shampoo and conditioner, plus been experimenting with their hair oil and leave-in conditioner, and it's honestly made my hair more shiny and more full than it's been in months. All of their custom hair products are freshly made to order. And FYI, if you're not happy with the results, Prose will take back the products, no questions asked. So this is what you need to do. Just go to prose.com/hot takes. It's prose.com/hot takes to take your free in-depth hair quiz and get 15% off your first order. Again, go to prose.com/hot takes for the free in-depth hair quiz and get 15% off. Rachel Campos, was it you're like, yeah. Was it surprising at all that she would go on to become a Republican commentator on Fox News and, go on?
Surprising. Not surprising. It's interesting because, we were all young people and we've changed. I'm not surprised. I think it's a coalescing of kind of that entertainment bug, bug, right? Like once you do something like The Real World, you get this entertainment bug and you start to think, particularly if you weren't someone in entertainment before, that like I have to somehow be in entertainment now. And so I think Rachel did a small stint on The View. Yes. And in some other places. And now she's hosting on Fox News. And trust me, I see her Twitter feed all the time. And I'm just like, I kind of ignore it, to be honest. But Rachel's on there all the time spouting all types of misinformation. I got to know Rachel pretty well. That's the interesting thing about the sort of political day and age that we live in, is that we're not able at all to separate people from ideology, right? They're one and the same. If your ideology is bad, from my perspective, then you're bad. And I think it's more nuanced than that. And being with these folks on the show and getting to know them personally, they're more nuanced than their public appearance, who they are publicly. So do I appreciate the things Rachel's putting out there? No. Do I feel like I know a other side of Rachel? Yes, I think I do. And I also think that when we talk about folks who are sort of Latinx, or Latinos or Hispanics or whatever word you use for, the sort of amalgamation of cultures that we call folks that are Latinx, they have different ways of approaching the world. And they have a set of experiences that push them in a certain direction politically. And I think that's Rachel's life. Like the conversations I had with her when we were in The Real World, I don't know about now, but we're very much about growing up in Arizona, right? Growing up in an immigrant family, right? Some of the values and the systems connected there. And, I came to understand her conservatism from being raised that way, right? And sort of believing in meritocracy and believing in all those things, because that's how her dad and mom worked really hard to provide for their kids. And so those values have now turned into this whole thing, and they connected with her desire to be in front of the camera. Those things have coalesced. So, yeah, I don't know if that helps.
No, it's fascinating.
But it's definitely sort of like how I see it. Yeah.
It's just wild. Like the combined effect of Rachel and Sean Duffy from Real World Boston, they're just combined presence on the country. It's crazy. They have 9 kids.
Yeah, they have a lot. I was marveling at that myself. I'm just like, wow, that's a lot of kids. But at the end of the day in this country, we're going to have to figure out how to locate the humanity in each other and then use that as a way to build empathy for each other. Because if we don't, it's going to tear us apart. I think for these conversations to be real, we have to be direct and clear about the injustices that are happening, and direct and clear about the fact that you're still a human being. And so I want to figure out how do I connect with you as a human being?
Well, this is exactly what you do professionally. You facilitate these diversity and inclusion workshops. Do you go into other companies, like brands?
Yeah, I consult at lots of large companies.
What does a diversity and inclusion workshop look like?
It can be a myriad of things. We talk about anti-racism, or what I like to call racial equity, right? Racial equity and allyship. I do some work around essential conversations. I don't call them challenging or difficult conversations. I say they're essential to our interpersonal skills and abilities. We need to learn how to have these conversations. So I go in and do a lot of work, but I do try to ground my work in, depending on the setting, like if I'm in a college, I will ground it in a lot of art. You know, I deeply believe in like Audre Lorde's work and her as a poet and how she felt that poetry and the art sort of displace people, right? They take them to another place. So we're not stuck in our heads, we get into our emotions. And so I do a lot of work to move people into their emotional space and to understand how these things might impact other folks. So like if I work with a group of white men who are on a board, which I do a lot of leadership trainings, I will start with love. Because if you think of white dominant culture men, it's really difficult for them to have a pathway to empathy or a pathway to compassion for other folks, to feel for them, right? Because they have power, they have all these things. And so I will do a training on love. I'll start with like, hey, when was the first time your heart was broken? And I'll tell them about the first time my heart was broken. And then we start to get into that and they're like, this is diversity work? And I'm like, yes, because it really is about these issues. And once we get to them at 10 years old with a broken heart, and they write about it and they start to talk about it, they start to move into an emotional space. And that's when I let them know for other people, that's what this is like. Like for women, right, who feel alienated at your company, right, who are thinking about, should I stay here or should I leave? This is such a bro culture. It hurts. Like it's not just an intellectual experience for women who are dealing with this, it's emotional. And so I have to bring these groups into emotional spaces so then I can bring them back into an intellectual space and say, so what are we going to do about it?
That's beautiful. Wow.
Powerful.
Very powerful. It makes me want, you're talking about Audre Lorde. Are there any specific pieces of music that you use?
You know, I am working right now on getting some more music, but what I've done historically is just done my own poetry as part of it, right? So my poetry is the way that I break that gap. And in corporate environments, it's hilarious because people are not expecting you at all to show up and do poetry. They're like, what is this? And some people might write it off as being performative, but for me, it's not. Like I know the scholarship and I'm doing the poetry for a specific tactical reason. And the tactical reason is to get people into a different space. And if I showed up and I just talked about all the research, which I do also, then they're in an intellectual space and I'm taking them deeper into an intellectual space and I'm privileging rationality, which I actually think is very Western, to be honest, right? If you look at other cultures and you look at their ancient history, it was much more about cosmology, right? They were thinking about where do I fit in the universe, not how do I order the universe so that it fits my design. Right, which is all what rationality is. And so I'm very curious about like, how do we have these other approaches that are about cosmology? So music, like you said, poetry, the arts bring people into a cosmological view. Like it lets us experience things from like, I just smoked the joint and I'm looking at the stars, right? Like that's cosmology. It's not about like, how am I being rational right now?
Final thought on the real world. The aftermath, what happened when you moved out of the house?
When I moved out of the house, it was a bit of a whirlwind. A lot of personal stuff came up for me. It was interesting to be gone for 6 months in a way. And my personal life sort of moved on, right? I think there was an assumption on my part that like I would go to this house, do this thing, come back and things would be the same. So my best friend's dad died sort of right when I left the real war house. And that was traumatic for him. And for me, I came back to an empty apartment because, like I said, my best friend was my roommate, and he, kind of decided to move to New York with his partner at the time. So suddenly I'm alone. I'm like, what am I doing here? Then there were all these press junkets, and so we're interviewing with, entertainment and all this stuff. And then there was just the fanatics, the sort of fanatics, like. I went to a mall where I would normally go and someone recognized me. And then there was a huge crowd of people that literally chased me out of the mall trying to get autographs. And I was just uncomfortable with that level of fame to start off with. So there were lots of experiences like that. I mean, there was dating got really weird. Like, people would kind of approach me and be attracted to me. And then they would bring up that they saw me on the real world. And, I didn't know how authentic that was. Like, did they want to be with me or did they want to be with this guy on TV? And so there was just a lot of this kind of like double guessing, which I never had in my life before that. And then I got accustomed to it. I went on the road. I started traveling. I started doing a lot of speeches, diversity speeches, and that I think helped me find some balance in it. So I was able to find balance going out into the world and doing something that I thought had impact, which is how I usually ground myself. I have to find something in it that, is socially impactful. And so this kind of work, that's when I went on the train to do this kind of work. And I went back to school and all that. So
I guess ultimately, how did this real world experience, the reality TV experience, change your life for the better?
Well, I can tell you it opened a ton of doors for me. Like, I was able to walk into certain places that I would have never had access to just because I was on the real world.
Like what?
I mean, so many things. I mean, right after the show aired, I could literally go into any nightclub I wanted to for free, right? It was just kind of like, I mean, that's just like a simple example. But also, I started getting invited to colleges to speak. I started making money doing that, right? Like, actually made a living. I still make a living off of it in addition to what I do. I was able to like really be a consummate artist because I had this sort of income stream. I built a studio out and started making music for other artists. I was just able to kind of like think about and design the sort of lifestyle that I wanted. And I don't think I would have had that without the real world. I wouldn't have been able to say, like, I moved to New York, I lived in Brooklyn, I had my own place, all of those things. I grew up with limited resources. Mm-hmm. Like I remember a year where I had $10 for the whole year, right? So to go from having very little to, from my perspective, having an abundance, that was a brave new world for me. It was something I hadn't experienced. And to be a young person doing that was really interesting, to sort of be like this person in New York that had enough money to have their own apartment and to go to a cafe and spend 3 hours writing poetry. Like that, it was that life for me. It was that kind of bohemian lifestyle, which was facilitated by a low cost of living when we think about, sort of the beatnik poets and stuff. Mm-hmm. But for me, it was, I actually had the resources to do it. And so it was a very different life than I'd ever experienced. How
long were you in New York before you moved back to San Francisco?
So I was in New York for 4 years. And my best friend, Will Powell, again, is a hip hop playwright, pretty well known playwright. And he was my partner in Midnight Voices in our band. And Will and his partner, who is now his wife, decided that they were going to move back to San Francisco. Before that happened, he had a production in San Francisco. He was touring it around the country at a theater called Theater Artaud, and I created the music for his production, for his sort of one-man solo play. And so he said, hey, Mohammed, do you want to come to San Francisco with me and play the music live? And so I did that. And we were there for 2 weeks. I think we had a residency. And I was playing the music and he was performing. And while I was in San Francisco, I met this amazing woman named Karen. And we spent a whole day walking around San Francisco talking and just became amazing friends. It was like I met my best friend, my other best friend. Mm-hmm. And once I moved back to New York, once I went back to New York and I heard that they were leaving, I said, I'm leaving too. I need to go and be with her. And so we drove across country, and Karen is now my partner, is my wife, and the rest is kind of history.
Amazing.
So, that brought me back to the Bay Area and brought me back to, and then I lived in LA for a while. We lived in LA and we lived in Portland, Oregon, and now we're back in the Bay Area. So,
Mohammed, I can't thank you enough. This has been amazing. I love talking to you.
Ditto.
Yeah, you're an amazing person. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. I appreciate that. It's weird because I'm talking about things I haven't talked about in such a long time. Thank you for inviting me to do your show.
Of course. If people want to reach out to you, I know you have like a very low profile on social media. How can people, if people want to reach out, email you, talk to you, what's the best way for someone to connect with you?
So my website is Mo Speaks. People can hit me up there. If they want to hit me on Twitter, even though I'm not a fan of Twitter, but I do get my DMs from Twitter. I'm actually on LinkedIn a lot, which is interesting because a lot of people will recruit me for their company to do work at their company. So, I'm more on the business side than I am on the social media side. I actually think a lot of social media is a waste of time. So that's why you don't see me on those platforms that often.
Understood. Understood.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. You can follow me, JessXNYC, follow the show account, Hot Takes Deep Dives. And again, Mohammed, I mean, if you guys have not yet seen Real World San Francisco, I know that it's streaming now on the Paramount Plus streaming service where you're watching the Real World reunion. I mean, this is legit the best season of the Real World, the one that like culturally impacted society in the ultimate profound way. So just thank you so much, Mohammed.
Thank you, Jess. Have a great day.
You too.
All right.